Okay, welcome to the Shropshire Partners in Care webinar on the Mental Capacity Act. This is our third webinar, and today we are joined by Lorraine Currie, who is an independent Mental Capacity Act consultant. And you can see that our subject today is decision-making, tips and reminders for assessing capacity. So I'll now hand over to Lorraine Currie. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, let's make a start while that doorbell carries on ringing, I think, as we maybe get some people joining us. So this is really sort of going over what I'm sure you've all done in different courses and at different times. So it's really, that's why I've kind of described it as tips and reminders rather than starting completely from scratch. So I'm sure some of it will be familiar to you, but maybe presented in a different way, and always good to go over it anyway. Any questions? If you save them till the end, and then after the recording, I'll deal with them then. And if you think you won't remember by the time we get to the end, then just stick them in the chat and I can have a look at them at the end. Okay, so we're looking at some tips and reminders around assessing capacity. So what I'm aiming to do is to give some practical help with capacity assessments, a little bit of do's and don'ts, and then at the end, as ever, sort of where to go for further help or advice, assistance. And as Karen said, information will be made available to you. So I just want to start really by identifying, in terms of do's and don'ts, two mistakes that I think particularly, two mistakes that I think are made particularly. One is either to over-assess, and the other is to over-assume. So we know that the Mental Capacity Act, the first guiding principle is to assume capacity. And that's true, and we must assume capacity, but not in the face of some very compelling evidence about why we should assess. And I think there is a tendency, not with you guys, I'm speaking generally across the board here, for people to say, oh, well, I assumed capacity. And to be honest, it's a kind of cop-out for not having assessed capacity. So although it is the first principle, we have to assume it. We can't rely on that assumption when there was really, really compelling evidence why we should have done an assessment. The other side of that coin is to over-assess. So, you know, assess, when there's no reason to doubt the person's decision-making. There's no reason to have any queries or concerns about that, but it's become a sort of tick box exercise. We've got a form, and on it, it says, does the person have capacity? So we're assessing everybody willy-nilly, you know, regardless of whether it's relevant or whether it's needed. So bear in mind that I think they are the sort of two extremes of getting it wrong. I'm just trying to get my head around the time now. We've started late. Anyway, I think I know where we are. So just a reminder to you of what it means to lack capacity. So the Mental Capacity Act gives us the definition. It's the one, the only definition. There is no other way of looking at this. There's no other test. There's just this test. So the Mental Capacity Act tells us that a person lacks capacity in relation to a matter if at the material time they're unable to make a decision for themselves about that matter. And the reason they can't make that decision is because they've got an impairment or a disturbance in the functioning of their mind or brain. One of the first questions that I was asked when I started doing MCA training was, what's the difference between the mind and the brain? I thought, oh my word, this is outside my sphere of expertise. So there's some really important things there in that, just that one sentence in that definition. So a person only ever lacks capacity about a matter, so a thing, a decision, something that needs to be decided. It's always at the material time. So we describe capacity as issue, decision, and time specific. And again, it's the reason that the person can't make their decision is because they've got some kind of mental impairment. Okay, so it's about a specific decision at a specific point in time. and the person's inability to make that decision is because they've got some kind of mental impairment. So how do we start? How do we kind of go about doing this assessment of capacity? And really, it comes down to 3 questions. The first question is the very obvious, simple question: can the person make the decision themselves? So that's our first question. If they can, then that's it, you know, everybody's happy and the decision is made by the person. If they can't make the decision, then we have to decide whether they've got some kind of impairment or disturbance in the functioning of their mind or brain. And if they have, we have to decide whether that mental impairment is the reason that they can't make the decision. So if you, maybe it'd be good to show it as a circle actually, but it's a kind of circle that one follows the other and so on, and it goes round. So can they make the decision? If not, do they have a mental impairment? And if so, is that the reason they can't make the decision? So just a reminder at this point, in case everybody's scribbling things, you will obviously get copies of the slides and the recording. So if it's not on the slides and you want to make a note, that's fine. But otherwise, you will get to see copies of these. Okay, so we're going to start with that first question. How do we know whether a person is in fact able to make their own decision? And we know that if they can do these 4 things. If they can understand, if they can retain, if they can use and weigh, and if they can communicate. If they can understand the information relevant to the decision. If they can retain that particular information. If they can use and weigh that information, so once they've heard it, understood it, they've logged it in their brain, can they do something with it? And then can they communicate their decision at the end? Someone who can do all 4 of those things has capacity to make their own decision. Someone who can't do any one of those things doesn't have capacity to make their own decision. Okay? Some people remember it doesn't work for me, this, but it does work for other people. So whatever works, use it by using those letters that U, R, U, C. If it's spelt a nice word, it might work for me, but it doesn't. But it's U for understand, R for retain, U for use and weigh, C for communicate, or rook. You know, if that helps you, then feel free to remember it in that way. It's stolen without permission from Neil Allen. Okay, but before we get into really looking at this functional test, we might call it, whether somebody can make a decision, the Mental Capacity Act first of all requires us to take all practicable steps to support the person to make the decision. So it says you can't conclude that somebody lacks capacity unless you've taken all practicable steps to help them make the decision. And actually it says, and you've done that without success. So first of all, you've got to think of all those really wonderful, imaginative, creative ways you can help someone make a decision. You got to try all of that stuff out. And if it fails, then you can move on to your looking at an assessment of capacity. Supporting a person to make their own decision, which is one of our possible next subjects for our next webinar. Supporting someone to make their own decision is a great solution for everyone, really, because it promotes the person's autonomy and independence, and it makes, I suppose, in a way, it's less work for you. You put in the work at the beginning to help them, but it's not poring over assessments. It's actually supporting a person to do something themselves. So it's not just about communication. I'll say some kind of practical things that can help in this way, but it's not just about how we communicate with somebody, although that's incredibly important. It is about making sure that they've got their hearing aids in, they're wearing their glasses, they're in a quiet space, they're not distracted. You know, don't try and do it when Coronation Street's on with me because I won't listen, you know, etc. Is it the right time for the person? So you've got to think about all of those things and what age you can use. You know, what have you got at your disposal that you can use to help the person with the decision? So it's a great thing to do. We have to do it. We have to do it first. So assuming then that we're moving on to actually carrying out an assessment of capacity, a lot of what I'm going to say is about you, not the person you're assessing. A lot of it is about you kind of getting your house in order first, and then everything is going to flow much more easily from there. So the first, and believe me, I know how obvious it sounds, but it can fall at this first hurdle. So make sure that you know clearly what the decision is that the person has to make. It really only needs to be one decision. So if there's a kind of number of them that are all connected, then they need to be separated as separate decisions. That doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes you might have a sort of medical decision that's got maybe something about medication, something else might be about treatment, but you're not going to do them together. You need to keep them separated out. So you need to have your clear decision, and then you need to work out what anyone would need to understand to make that decision. So here's the decision. What would somebody need to understand to make that decision? And then how are you going to give that information to the person in the most relevant way? And it's a good idea to record this. So if this was a decision about such a thing, a person would need to understand this, that, and the other. And this is what I'm going to share with the person and how I'm going to share it with them. Just to be clear here, I'm sticking to my chair because it's so hot. You didn't need to know that, did you? I'm talking really here about those kind of one-off decisions. Believe me, I'm not talking about the small things that you do every day. I'm not suggesting that you do a full written assessment of capacity before somebody has the breakfast, before somebody gets dressed, before somebody goes to take part in an activity. I'm not talking really about those very small day-to-day decisions. Yes, they do fall under the Mental Capacity Act. Yes, it is the same principle, but it only needs to be recorded in proportion to the decision. You know, I wouldn't expect to read 2 sides of A4 about John choosing which T-shirt he put on today. Am I expecting to understand what the options were, to retain the fact that he's got 2 T-shirts that are clean, to be able to use and weigh that in picking that one, not this one because it's hot? Do you understand? You're still going through the same sort of process, but it's very much in your head, and you may only need to record a couple of lines in care notes. I'm really talking today about something that you might just assess once or a couple of times, you know, maybe about managing someone's medication, maybe bigger decisions about spending money on something, looking at a care plan, that kind of thing. So just to be clear, there is a spectrum. There's the kind of really small day-to-day decisions at one end. Just record in proportion to that, or you'd never get any work done, you know. And then the bigger decisions, as they get bigger, you expect to see more written about them. It's quite an obvious sort of trajectory. Is that the right word? I think it is. Okay, so what's the decision? How can I give the information? And how do I know it's been understood? More to the point. So let's take a couple of examples. So we're at the start of an assessment. Joan's got toothache and needs to decide whether to visit the dentist. So first of all, I'd expect to see the practicable steps you've taken to support Joan to make the decision herself. So you might say, I've talked it over with Joan. We've discussed it a few times because she's had a lot of pain. I've shown her a short DVD about visiting the dentist. So you will record the ways you've tried to support her with her own decision. Sorry, I've got things popping up. So then we're going to move on to look at how do we know when someone's understood? So we've got Arthur now. So Arthur needs to make a decision about taking blood pressure medication. So we would ask ourselves, what would anyone need to understand to make that decision? And I'm going to suggest that we'd need to know what the medication is, what the side effects might be, what would happen if you don't take it, and whether there's any other options. So that roughly is it. There may be a few more things that you can think of, but I would say roughly that's it. So you need to give that information to Arthur and record that you've done it. So I've explained to Arthur about the medication, what will happen possibly if he takes it, what will happen if he doesn't, and what the GP's perhaps said about options. But the person doesn't need to understand every element of what's been explained to them. So Arthur wouldn't need to know, and I can't even say this because I don't know it myself, but Arthur wouldn't need to know how the heart works, what makes blood pressure go up and down, what the, I was going to say those, something systole and something else systole. They've got words, haven't they? You know, what the top figure means, what the bottom figure means. We wouldn't expect anybody to know and understand all of that complex information. We expect them to know the salient points, the key bits to make a decision, and for you to record that on your assessment. And then when you've given that information, how do you know if someone's understood it? So you're going to record some of your questions and you're going to record the answers. But case law said we've got to be really careful that we don't expect more of people when their capacity is questioned than we do of those whose capacity is undoubted. So don't set the bar too high, you know, in expecting them to understand all manner of things. The bar has got to be set really quite low, just what anybody would need to understand around the key points. And also not to start with a blank canvas. So we wouldn't go to Arthur and say, what do you know about blood pressure medication? We'd have to give him that information first. We'd have to share the options with him before we expect to test whether he's understood it. Does this make sense? Yes? Somebody give me a nod. Anybody? A wave? Thank you, Nicola. Great. So we might ask Arthur, we might say, we've had a nice chat, me and Arthur, about blood pressure medication. His daughter's come to see him. Just tell your daughter what we've been discussing today, you know, assuming he wants to share that information with her. But you get the gist, don't you? Maybe a different person working with Arthur, you can say, just tell me back what we've discussed. It's something that I do with my husband, I have to say, when I give him series of instructions, I now have to say, tell me what I've just told you. I don't know why, but I do. So it's that kind of very everyday, you know, how do we know they've understood? Get them to tell it us back. Maybe ask the same question in a slightly different way. Maybe if you've got someone who's got a tendency to say yes to everything, come at it a different way so that yes doesn't quite work. And then record whether you think you are satisfied, whether they can or can't understand the information. So that's our first bit. We've got to know what the information is, share it with the person in a way they can understand, and then test that they've understood it. The second requirement is that they can retain it. They need to retain it long enough to make a decision. So it's really important to me that it doesn't say remember, it says retain. So it's not something they've got to hang on to for like forever and lay it down in their memory banks and retrieve it at will. They've just got to be able to hold on to the information you've given them long enough to make a decision. Now, the more serious the decision is, the longer they might have to hold on to that information for. But in general, if a person is able to understand, retain that information, make a decision. They might forget they've ever even had the conversation by the next day, but at the time it needed to be made, they were able to satisfy these requirements. It also doesn't rule them out if they say, oh, stop, I'll have to write it down. If I don't write it down, I won't have a chance of remembering what you've said. That doesn't rule them out. They can still use aids to help them to retain information. And it is about holding on to it at the time that the decision needs to be made. And that's really sufficient for the test that we're looking at. Okay, so they understand, they've been able to hold on to the information. And the next thing they have to do is be able to use and weigh the information. And this is really the key part, I would say, of decision making. So it's been described as the capacity to actually engage in the decision-making process itself, to see the various parts of the argument and how they relate to each other. So to think through those things like, well, if I do that, what will that mean? And if I don't, what will that mean? You know, to think through those kind of consequences, because actually not making a decision, it is a decision in itself, isn't it? You know, if I don't take medication, then I've decided not to take it, and something might happen as a consequence. So the person needs to be able to do something with that information you've given them, not only to understand it, but be able to use it. And we need to be really careful here to those conditions where people may understand very, very well, but not be able to use that information when they need to. You know that I can't mobilize without a walking frame. You've explained it to me, I've understood it, I've retained it, but I still keep trying to get up and walk with the walking frame, because at the relevant time, I forget all of that stuff. I can't use and weigh it when I need to use and weigh it. And some people might have the right answers, but not able to apply them in the situation. I can't remember if I told you this story already or someone else, but anyway, repetition is a very good thing. So way before I came to Shropshire, I worked with a young man with autism and a learning disability, and he went to college. And one of the things that he was told that he had very clearly, he understood and he could use it, was if there's a problem in the classroom, you tell the person in charge. And he lived by that as his kind of rule. But when he went out shopping or to the cinema, to other places, and people talked to him about risk and what would you do, he said, I'd tell the person in charge. So he couldn't change the rule. You know, in the street, there isn't anyone in charge. You know, it's different. He wasn't able to kind of take what he knew, but apply it differently. And equally, some people have got great answers, but as they're telling you, you know that they're unlikely to be able to apply that. We'll look at this a little bit more later on. So let's have a look at an example. So we've got Barry, who's diabetic and had a traumatic brain injury 3 years ago. Barry is great in conversation. He knows exactly what he should and shouldn't eat. If you use visual images with him, he can select from those images, you know, what he should eat, what he shouldn't eat. However, if he's ever out alone and he sees chocolate, he will buy and eat several Mars bars. Afterwards, in conversation with staff, he can explain why it wasn't a good idea, but the impulsivity that is caused by his brain injury means that he can't use the information, even though he understands it. Okay, so he's understood, but when push comes to shove, as we say in Oldham, I don't know if you say it everywhere, when push comes to shove, he can't apply it, okay? Because the bit of his kind of brain that isn't working results in impulsivity. That means he just doesn't apply that information. Some people talk about it as offline and online ability, which is quite a nice way as well. When it's offline, it's just me and Barry sitting there. He's got all the right answers. But when it's online, if there's chocolate there, he can't apply it and he can't use it. Okay, the fourth requirement then is that the person can communicate their decision. It doesn't have to be verbal. They can communicate in any way. It might be very minimal residual communication, but as long as they can make themselves understood, you know, it could be eye pointing, blinking, it could be yes and no cards, but it's any level really of communication. And you need to show that you have tried all kinds of ways to facilitate communication, including tools and aids, but also the support of people who may know the person well, who may know, oh no, I know that look, you know, that look means they definitely don't want to do that, you know, and I know that look, yeah, they're really keen on that. So don't forget those people who know the person well. Okay, so we've done the first bit. So you will see that described as the functional test, because it is functional. It's about in practice. You know, the Mental Capacity Act is not an airy-fairy act. It's a very, very practical piece of legislation. It's about any situation, any decision at the time. If they can understand, retain, use and weigh and communicate, they can make their decision. Small scale for small decisions, something in the notes about how you know they've understood, retained, and how they've used that information. Bigger decisions, bigger and better recording. And the Mental Capacity Act talks about the more sort of serious the decision, the more professional the role that is expected to be taking that decision. You know, so you wouldn't be making a decision about surgery. You know, that's going to be the surgeon. You wouldn't be making a decision about implementing a completely new care plan or admitting somebody to residential care in the beginning. That's most likely to be the social worker. Okay, so we've got our functional test. We have to imagine at this stage that the person couldn't do at least one of those 4 things. So now we have to say, does the person have an impairment or a disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain? And this can be temporary or it can be permanent. Let me just, yeah. So there's been some interesting case law on this, which I think I've put in the note that I've done for you. Sometimes it used to be called the diagnostic test, but we're moving very much away from that description. The Mental Capacity Act doesn't call it that. The Mental Capacity Act doesn't ask for a diagnosis. It asks for evidence that there is reason for us to think that the person's got some kind of impairment or disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain. So problems with their memory, some post-operative confusion, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be nailed to a specific diagnosis. It can be temporary. So you may have, sorry, I'll have to have a drink. You may have someone with a UTI who's confused. You know it's going to be temporary, and within the sort of 3 days of antibiotics, they'll start to improve. It can be permanent, as in a learning disability, could be the effects of a stroke, which can be both temporary and permanent. It could be the effects of medication, which sometimes cause confusion for people. It can also be drug and alcohol related. You know, the person who's admitted to A&E with a broken arm, who's completely drunk, would be seen to lack capacity to consent to that surgery if it needed to happen at that point in time. If it is a temporary impairment, then really you need to think, why am I assessing capacity now? You know, it would only be if there was something urgent, a decision that needed to be made quite urgently, that you would do it during a period of temporary impairment. If you are doing, you need to say why it couldn't wait. You know, why do it now? Why not wait until? So as I say, it can be drowsiness, concussion, drug and alcohol, as well as things like brain injury, stroke, dementia, learning disability. So we need to know that the person, we've already looked at this functional test, and we're not convinced they can make their own decision because they couldn't perhaps either understand the information or they couldn't use and weigh it. We know that they've got a mental impairment because they've got dementia. So now we have to say, we have to do the bit that joins the dots. Is that mental impairment the reason that they can't make the decision? And it's not always a slam dunk that. You know, it may be something completely different. And the reason we were alerted to this some time back was a case that I've referenced earlier on in the slides, CC and K, no, it's not, PC and NC and the City of York. And this was a woman with a learning disability who had formed a relationship with a serial sex offender. And he was in prison at the time she formed a relationship with him. She was found to have capacity to marry him, which she did, but he was still in prison. And then it came the time for his release. And there was a second decision, interestingly, about whether she had capacity to make the decision to cohabit with him. It's an odd one because normally marriage and cohabitation go together, don't they? I'm at this moment wanting to sing something about a horse and carriage, but I'll resist. So normally when you get married, you live with that person, but I guess the fact that he was in prison prevented that. There was a long stream of evidence about how he defended against women like her in the past. Everyone else suspected that that is what he would do again. That risk was very, very high. So there was a capacity assessment about her appreciation of the risk of living with him. The judge decided that there wasn't enough evidence to kind of push away this assumption of capacity, because he said, maybe she's not weighing the risk, but that's not because of her learning disability. It's because she loves him. And he says, I didn't do it. All those women set me up, or words to that effect. And she believed him. So the judge said, it's not a learning disability that prevents her from using and weighing that information. It's because she's in love with this man. We might have our own views on that. I have my own views, which is maybe if she didn't have a learning disability, she wouldn't be so ready to believe what he said. But that was the court's decision. So we have to know that the reason the person cannot make the decision is that it's the impact that the mental impairment has on them. So here's an example. Joan couldn't decide whether she wanted to go out today because she had a bad cold and felt really groggy. So the reason she's not going to make the decision about going out is because she's got a bad cold and she just feels kind of under the weather and can't decide. Another option is Joan couldn't decide whether to have a shower today because she has dementia, which affects her memory, and she wasn't able to remember that she needed one. Okay, so in the first example there, Joan's got dementia, but she can't make the decision about going out because she's got a cold. It's not anything to do with the dementia on that occasion. But on the second occasion, the decision about having a shower, she can't make because her memory is affected by dementia and she most likely thinks she's already had a shower. Okay, so we have to be able to bring this circle back round. Functional test, if there's one bit they can't do in that functional test, have they got a mental impairment? If they have, is that the reason that they couldn't do one of those functional elements? Okay, so in a nutshell, really, that's our assessment of capacity. So my next question then to myself, as much as to you, is if it's that easy, why is it sometimes so hard? And I don't expect you to answer that. What I'm going to try and do is shed a little bit of light on that. So I think there are some common mistakes that everyone makes. Firstly, not providing support at the right time and in the right way. Sometimes we can just kind of miss the moment, you know, thinking about practicable steps and how we can support decision making. Getting that in at the right time to be of most value to the person is kind of really, really important. And it's a big responsibility on us, because the law says you've got to have done that and failed before you can say somebody lacks capacity. So, you know, the court could say down the line, well, what did you do? Show me what you did to support decision making. Another mistake is failing to explain the decision that is needed clearly. And I see this all the time, lots and lots and lots of capacity assessments where I read it'll say, what is the decision to be made? And it's so convoluted that I can't understand it. And I think, well, you didn't understand it when you wrote that. So how are you ever going to test a person's understanding? Don't overcomplicate it. It's simple. It might be, is the person able to make a decision about a current care plan? Is the person able to make a decision about buying such a thing? Are they able to make a decision about having contact with such a body? Keep it as simple, straightforward as the decision needs to be, and keep it clear, and don't mix them all up into lots of different ones. Not giving the relevant information in the best way. And again, it's another story that I've told, but it's a great example of my daughter, who's got a brain injury, was in conversation with her PA. PA says, do you have a good time today, Grace? Grace says, yeah. She said, did you enjoy it? She says, yeah, it was great. Are you going to go again? Grace says, yeah, yeah. I then said, Grace, do you know what she's talking about? She said, no. So there was no introduction to the conversation. PA comes in, did you have a good time today? Grace's memory is not functioning. She can't go, oh, what did I do today? Oh, yeah, I went to such a place. That must be what she's talking about. That was a massive leap. So it needed to be, oh, you went swimming today, Grace, didn't you? Did you enjoy it? Do you want to go again? Framing the thing that you're talking about for the person. Checking back. Am I making sense? Do you understand what I'm talking about? That's how we're going to make sure we communicate relevant information in the best way. Is this a visual person? Think about all those. I've got another presentation actually that I do about language. Think about all those really weird things that we say, that if you are working with a person with maybe very concrete thinking, you know, people will say, we've got to get our ducks in a row and then we'll do such a thing. What ducks? They'll say, oh, it's full of beans. Really? What kind of beans? We have the most weird kind of bits of language that you have to look at before you try and communicate with somebody and think, oh, are they going to make sense of what I'm saying? Is it a person who needs to see visual things rather than telling them? Is it better to show them? Thinking about how you're going to give that relevant information in the best way. I've got a couple of examples in a minute. Not leaving enough time. You know, sometimes, unfortunately, decisions don't have time. You know, a lot of those like hospital discharge decisions, that's what social workers will say to me, but Lorraine, we haven't got time. And I know that, and my heart goes out to them. But at the same time, would you want to make a massive, massive decision under pressure like that about anything? So, you know, if you haven't got time, make a little bit of a short-term decision and then spend a bit of time working with the person and maybe looking at it over a period of time. Just leaving that space, picking the right time for them. You know the people that you support, you know whether they're better in the morning or they're better in the evening. You know whether if they're hungry, they're not going to talk to you, or if when they've eaten, they just want to go to sleep. You know all these practical things about people. Another mistake is just taking the person's answers, but not watching what they do. You know, well, they say this, so I'll write it down. Yeah, but did you see whether they actually do that? Because that's key. Not only what they say, but what they do. Not checking information where necessary. Again, you have memories that stick in your mind. I remember doing an assessment. It was a character assessment, I guess, with a man living with his daughter. He had dementia, and you know, he was telling me a wonderful story. He does everything himself, getting dressed, washed, showered, everything. And his daughter was sort of doing that. I don't know if you can see me on the screen, but kind of pointing ahead, you know, And when I look down, he's got his pajamas on underneath his trousers. You know, I mean, he's not going to come to any great harm with that. But it was enough to say to me, there's a bit more to this story than meets the eye. Maybe he's not quite doing all of the things that he's saying he's doing. So check with people who know the person, and not having any trick questions. You know, it drives me mad. I can't remember whether I've put it in here. I hope that I have. But the Mental Capacity Act is not about tricking people. It's not about asking them a question that they won't know the answer to, so that we can then say they lack capacity and we can then just get on with doing what we think they should do anyway. There are no trick questions here. Everything we do should be about trying to help a person to make their own decision. Another mistake is not considering fluctuating capacity. So someone asked this question, and I think I've put slides in about it, about what we do when we know their capacity varies. So I won't say any more about that because I think I've put a slide in. If I haven't, then I will say some more anyway. So helpful tips. I haven't got the picture of my next slide. I don't know why I've done that. So I'm not getting that today, but it's got a mind of its own. So who am I? So the helpful tips really are the opposite of what you might do wrong. So give yourself enough time. Do all of your thinking first. Do that bit about what is it they need to understand. How am I going to share this with them? Do all of that first. Sometimes it's quite nice, you know, playing around with, I could use photographs, I don't know if you have access to things like talking mats, which are quite nice ways of sort of moving pictures around to work out whether a person likes something or doesn't, and things like that. So planning about using tools and aids, being clear with the person what you're doing and why. So again, it's not a secret and it's not a trick. I need to see whether you can make this decision yourself. So we're going to have a chat about it. This is the decision and this is what we're going to do. So being specific and remembering that capacity is time and decision specific. Just because this time last year, somebody couldn't do such and such a thing, well, it's different time, different place, different thing. Just because they lack capacity for one decision doesn't mean they will lack capacity for any other decision. They may not be able to decide about care, but they might be able to decide everything else. Or they might not be able to decide about contact with a certain person, but be able to decide everything else. Ah, good. That's what I was hoping was there. So the key thing really in thinking, you know, in me saying it's not a trick, is that there should be no testing if there hasn't been, just a bit of a double negative. So without telling, there shouldn't be any testing. Yeah. So you shouldn't be asking somebody something if you haven't told them that information in the first place. So no telling, no testing. That's one you can remember. That helps me. Maybe it'll help you. I'll just say a little bit about that, because I see that often on financial capacity assessments. So I see people writing things like, John wasn't able to tell me how much his pension was. And I go, well, did he know? I couldn't tell you how much John's pension was either, because I don't know. Did he know? So don't ask him that question if you haven't given him that information. John, this is how much your pension is. This is how much your benefits are. I'm going to come tomorrow and we'll have a chat about them. Tomorrow you can ask him how much his pension is because you've told him. And it's okay to check. You know, it is okay to check things out with other people. So an example here is I asked Mr. Smith if he was able to have a wash by himself, and he said he could, indicating the sink in the corner of his room. I asked if he had a routine, and he said that every morning and night he had a wash. He explained that at home he had a wash basin upstairs. I asked if he could get upstairs, and he said yes, pointing out that he uses the stairs at the care home. This is all in the information gathered from, this is a real example that I've just changed the names. This is all real example from Mr. Smith in the assessment. However, the assessor's then spoken with care staff, and has written, I understand that Mr. Smith uses the lift at the care home and he was not able to get upstairs when he lived at home. Okay, so it's getting that balance between putting in your capacity assessment what the person says, because their words are very, very important. But if there's anything that's different to that, then you need to show that. So Mr. Smith says such a thing, however, the care staff tell me that, or however, I have observed Mr. Smith every day for the last however many weeks, and he's never been able to use the stairs. So it is okay to check out what people are saying. It's also not one strike and you're out. What do I mean by that? So there is a sort of tendency, certainly in social work, I don't know if this is the same necessarily with more direct care providers, to sort of take the view, I've done the capacity assessment, tick, some electronic system gets pressed and the capacity assessment's done, and that's it, game over. You know, as far as the electronic world is concerned, the capacity of that person's been assessed. That can only ever mean for one decision at one point in time. It's forever changing and it's forever developing. So it's not something that we can only assess once. It's not something that is fixed for the rest of forever, because everybody changes. They may deteriorate, they may improve, they may learn new skills, or they may lose skills. So it's never going to be fixed in time. You can make a short-term decision and say, this is kind of based on this interview and assessment at this point in time, I'm coming to the conclusion that Mr. Smith lacks capacity. But I think if we do a bit of work with him around his finances, he will then be able to make his own decisions. So come back to it. It's not something that only happens once. Okay. Ah, good. So I was hoping this was here. My memory is terrible. I can't remember what I've put in and what I haven't. So you've asked about fluctuating capacity, and this is incredibly challenging. So, and there's a number of ways in which capacity might fluctuate. So the person might not be able to decide now, but we know that in the future, they may be likely to be able to make their own decision. So the example there would be a UTI. We know that if we treat the physical condition, their decision-making will improve. So that's the capacity is fluctuating between now and the relatively short-term improvement. A person might have long periods where they're perfectly able to decide, but have occasional times of incapacity. So maybe some mental health conditions where the person has just a sort of episode, for want of a better word, during which they are more likely to lack capacity, but long periods where they have capacity. Or the impact of their condition affects their decision making on a more variable basis. So that kind of sundowning. Maybe if you see them at this time of day, they're great. And if you see them later on, they're not able to make decisions. So we've got different ways that capacity fluctuates. So sometimes we have to take a different approach to it. So sometimes we have to take a view over a longer period of time. And it grates a little bit with the idea that capacity is time and decision specific, but the courts have come to this decision. They've said, really, it came about mostly in relation to a person with diabetes. I can't remember the case, where the judge was kind of looking at it from the perspective of care staff. Sometimes this person could do bits of their diabetes management themselves. Sometimes they couldn't. It was up, down, up, down, up, down. And he said, it's not really possible for the care staff to support the person. What we've got to do is take a longitudinal view. So let's look at it over a slightly longer period of time and say, over that period of, say, I don't know, a month or 3 months, was it more likely that they didn't have capacity? And he came to the conclusion that that was the case. And so the staff were able to act in the person's best interests. rather than being tied to having to do probably capacity assessments like every day, twice a day, which just, you know, doesn't make sense. So sometimes you need to just take that longer term view, because that's the nature of their condition. Sometimes you need to look at them during the good times and during the bad times. So with sundowning as an example, if this is a decision and they can make it, and they can make it in the morning, then get the decision made at the best time for them. At other times, they may not be able to make their own decision, and consequently you then have to assess capacity and act in their best interests. Sometimes, and it depends what the condition is, but I've seen this as a suggestion for people where alcohol's an issue. You can gather the person's views when they're able to express them, and you can use those views when you need to make a best interest decision. So I've seen people try and say, look, when this person's sober, they say, look, yeah, if you find alcohol, I want you to pour it away. And then, of course, when they start drinking, that changes. And so you then have to make a best interest decision. So you've got some quite good evidence that while they had capacity, they were in agreement to you taking certain steps and certain actions. So plan ahead. What would they want to happen if they had a crisis and their capacity was affected? Let's say if they insisted on leaving the care setting during the night because they had to go and let the sheep out or in, or whatever you do with sheep. You know, while they've got those more rational moments, can you talk to them about what they think you should do if they tried to leave in the circumstances that I've just described? I hope that makes sense. So somebody asked that about capacity varying at different times a day. So there's a few ways you might approach it that I've just tried to outline. Just make decisions when they've got their good bits is one way. If it's affecting one particular big decision, might be better to take a longitudinal view, i.e. over this longer period of time. A third approach is, can you get them on board really and get their views while they've got capacity about what they think you should do when they haven't. Okay. And then the importance of this thing that we can rather fancily call triangulation. Just means there's 3 bits to it, so it looks quite good as a triangle. So first of all, you're gonna, if you're assessing capacity, you're going to take the person's views. Their account is really, really, really our first starting point. But you can check that with others, and you can observe them in the real world. The man who says that he has a wash, that he goes upstairs at home, if you observe him, is that borne out? So think about triangulation in your capacity assessment. Can't read what it says. But yeah, it's got a, oh, can I get rid of it? Yes, Lorraine, press the cross and it'll go. Hey. So my advice is be practical, be confident, be honest. So you have these skills more than anybody else. These really excellent practical skills, because you do this day in, day out. It's no different because we've just given it a kind of legal title. Practical skills, try practical things all the time. Show and tell is better than any kind of complicated conversation with you know, fancy words and technical phrases. Use your skills to support the person's skills, because once again, that's what you're good at. It is okay if you're unsure to ask an expert in the mental impairment. So if you get a complicated impairment, you know, some of those things like corticos, alcohol-related dementia, sometimes brain injury, some of the things that you might think, you know, are just not quite fitting with your expertise, then get some advice on that particular disability or impairment. Don't be afraid, as I've already said, to make a temporary decision. And don't be afraid to say it's borderline. If you think this is really, really close, I can't call it. It's right on the edge of, you know, my husband's an independent assessor and we have these conversations a lot. He'll say, I could call it either way. You know, it's really, really finely balanced. Then put that in your assessment. And consequently, don't be afraid to repeat it. You know, it isn't, as I've said, a one-time thing. So some of those practical things that I've tried to encourage people to make, I enjoy doing this. I do it a lot for my daughter. You know, things have to be visible, visual. She's got difficulty with reading words, so you can use pictures. So this is not for her. This is from a course about assessing financial capacity. But it's talking to somebody about what kind of thing might be appropriate to give as a gift. So, you know, you're talking about giving your daughter something for Christmas. Which one of these would it be? Would it be the sports car, the big posh house, the buckets full of gold jewelry, you know, flowers, books, chocolates? So it's making something yourself that is relevant to the person. And generally, when you're doing that, to make it something that is, you know, if you're talking about their own home, is this someone who's safe to go back home? Then where you can, having photographs of that home, not a home, you know, not something somewhere else. I remember a man who was assessed in hospital to go home. This was a man who'd had elective surgery for a hip. So it wasn't anything, you know, unplanned, but he was very confused post-operatively. And then because of his age, things started to snowball in a way that they shouldn't, but they do. And an OT then was, everything seemed to stand or fall on this kettle assessment. Could he make a cup of tea before he went home? I mean, I straight away go, well, why did it matter? Somebody could leave him a flask. You know, surely that's not the be all and end all. But the thing was, nobody asked the question about what his kettle looked like. Did he have an electric kettle? Was his kettle one that maybe he put on an Aga? You know, did he even use a kettle? So maybe he failed the test because it wasn't like his kettle. You know, this man was saved by a best interest assessor from heading, sorry to speak about it like that, but from heading to residential care that he didn't need to be in. Purely on the basis of this kettle, really. This was a man who'd been a fighter pilot, you know, and taken risks that we can never even dream of. And yet he couldn't make a drink using the kettle. So think very long and hard about what you can do, how you can communicate things to people by making something. Google's brilliant, you know, you can Google a picture of anything, and you can stick it on a Word document, and it's really useful to use in working with people. Does anybody have talking mats that you're aware of, Karen? If you can give me a nod or a no. Or
I don't know specifically which organisations would, but I certainly know that some people have access training that Joint Training Shropshire Council have delivered on using talking mats in the past. So I strongly suspect that they are still being used out there, Lorraine.
Yeah, great. I mean, you can make your own sort of thing again. It's just that idea of a thumbs up and a thumbs down, or a smiley face and a sad face, and then a group of photographs about things that people can do themselves, and then you sort of make those into bigger and smaller groups. So it's a really useful visual way of doing things with people, but there's lots and lots and lots of ideas out there. So a good assessment has been described by a judge, so we've got to take notice, haven't we, as criteria focused. So it knows what it's been written about. It's about the specific decision. Evidence-based, so there's evidence in there, not lots of things saying clearly this and clearly that and no evidence, just evidence. That's all we need. Person-centered. It's about that particular person and why we know that they can or can't understand, and how we know that they can use and weigh. And it's not judgmental. And another one of my favourite stories, which was real, and when I was working previously with social workers more. And it was what I will forever know as the sausage roll test. So this was an assessment about somebody not having capacity in relation to various things, but finances were one. And young man, and the evidence was that he'd bought a really, really expensive tracksuit. First of all, the expense of the tracksuit was relative to the social worker writing it. So I think it was, let's say, £100. Now, that is a lot of money. I agree it's a lot of money. For some people, it might be a small amount of money. So that was a bit judgmental anyway. But then her conclusion was that he'd bought a sausage roll from Greggs, and in running for the bus, he dropped it into the bag with the tracksuit. Therefore, getting grease on the tracksuit, therefore he wasn't able to use and weigh the information about the amount, about the cost of that tracksuit and the value of it. Now I can see people's faces. That's how I felt. So I'm like, you know, lots of people wouldn't necessarily think that a sausage roll is greasy and the grease is going to come off and it's going to get onto your clothes. It was such a stretch, but it was a genuine, you know, I still, now I don't worry about that social worker being on training, but I used to do. You know, it was genuine. It was from their perspective, but it could only be described as judgmental. You know, I don't think that there would be any evidence that he'd done that without using and weighing the information. It was probably nothing to do with his learning disability, probably just seen the bus and ran, you know. So don't be judgmental. You know, we don't know how people live, and we can't make judgments about kind of things like how often they have a shower, how often they change their clothes, because based on what we do, because it's what we know about that person. It's about being person-centered and not judgmental. Okay. So I think that I've almost arrived at the end of talking you to death. So I've left you, I don't know why that one's black and the other one isn't. But what I've left you there, and I haven't gone into very much, but when I said at the beginning, we have to look at things that a person would need to know in order to make a decision, and then we test their understanding, and they have to understand the relevant information. Most of the work on that has been done for us by 39 Essex Chambers. So this second reference here, relevant information for different decisions, is brilliant. So it goes through medical treatment, care, sex, contact, hoarding, it now is a new one added, various sort of big decisions. And they've summarized in there what someone would need to know to make each of those decisions. So you don't have to do it. You can have a look in there and say, oh, this is about care. What do they say somebody needs to understand? Who's going to provide that care? What will happen if they don't? Who I can complain to, and so on. The work has been already done in lots of those cases. So I do recommend that to you. And it's incredibly useful. Both of those are really when assessing capacity. And one of the questions we were asked in advance of today was whether there was a specific tool. So we've now worked to sort of do a little tool for you to use as SPIC members for assessing capacities. That already been circulated, I think, or made available to people?
No, it hasn't yet. So I have added it to the resource Padlet for this session today. And when Deborah's back in work, Deborah will be emailing all the attendees from today with a link to that resource. And it is a Word document that you can directly use to type into. Yeah,
great. If you've got any feedback on it, I mean, it's a very, very straightforwardly simple form, really. It should be useful for any decision. As I say, it's not for those day-to-day decisions. Having a shower, changing your clothes. It's not for those decisions. The MCA is not about shutting people down because they can't do any work because they're too busy doing capacity assessments. So if there's anything you think might need adding or changing, then, you know, you can always let me know and we can have a look at some. Maybe that's something that we can do in the future. But we've done that to kind of support today, really. So I've totally lost what time we started. I think we would have ended at past, but we're a little bit over time. So if I end there and we end the recording, and it's been great to speak to you all, and I'll see you in just a minute.
Thanks, Lorraine, for that on behalf of Shropshire Partners in Care. It's some great resources for everyone to have a look at after the session today. So I am going to end the recording now.